Let's turn again to Mark chapter 4 and verse 41. Mark chapter 4 and verse 41. They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This is a well-known story. It's a story, I want to insist, about Jesus, the Son of God, not about the storms of life. Right through Mark's Gospel, the focus falls on Jesus. It's a gospel about Jesus, God's Son. And every incident is chosen because of its contribution towards the great portrait of Christ that Mark wants to produce. The baptism, the miracles, the transfiguration, the cross, the resurrection, all of those are focused so as to highlight the glory of Jesus as God's own Son. And that same concern dominates this episode. There is indeed a storm, there is a boat, and there are men. And there are points of contact between our own experience and those of Jesus within this narrative. And yet it is quite unjustifiable to reduce this great narrative to a simple allegory about the storms of human life. It is here for its great climax. They were terrified and they asked, "Who is this? What kind of man is this? Even the waves and the seas obey." So it's a story not about storms or about men in a boat. It's a story about Jesus, the Son of God. We see, first of all, the very simple directive of Christ: let us go over to the other side. Let's go over to the other side. Now we know exactly where the Lord was when he said this, and we know exactly when it was that the Lord said this. He had spent the day preaching and teaching. He was utterly spent and exhausted. The great physical effort of preaching in the open air, the strain in his voice, the constant pressure of crowds, the constant explaining, the endless flow of questions, it was all very, very wearing. And at the end of the day, at the end of that exhausting day, towards evening, the Lord said, "Let's get away. Let's go over to the other side." It's a great and poignant reminder to us of the physical and emotional frailty of the incarnate Son of God. He was God's own Son, and he was so available and so accessible to all those human needs. And all day long he had borne the pressure and borne the brunt of their inquiries and their demands. And now he's close to the limit of his own endurance. And he has to say, let's get away. Let's go to the other side. Even for him, it wasn't possible and it wasn't wise to keep the bow taut, tight, tense all the time. They need to escape into solitude. They need to be with himself. They need to reflect. They need to pray. They need to read. They need to meditate. They need to be with God. They need to be with the Word of God. And it's no use saying, but we're too busy. Because here was busyness. A man walking by God's time and doing God's will. And yet conscious that to do that will, he had to say, let us go over to the other side. The marvelous picture of God's own Son, of God's own Son exhausted, of God's own Son needing to recreate and to recharge his own batteries, the need to withdraw. And here, yes, the parallel with our own experience. We bearing our own little pressures. And we often tempted to imagine that efficiency depends upon our being workaholics, upon our own constant activity, upon our keeping the bow constantly tight and taut. And God rebuking us and saying that if his own Son needed to go across the other side, how much more so do we need those moments of recreation, of solitude, of simply being alone, those precious moments when the pressure is off. That's the first thing then. Let's go over to the other side. And the second thing is this. Those marvelous words of verse 38. Jesus in the stern is sleeping on a cushion. That cushion, you know, in itself, such a marvelous detail, authenticating Peter's recollection from which Mark got this story. The Lord asleep. Well, why is that so remarkable? It's remarkable because there was a storm blowing. Not only that, but there was a furious storm. They were in this small boat. And there was this furious storm, and the Lord is asleep in the stern. Matthew calls it literally a seismic storm. It was so furious as if the whole deep were heaving, as if the mountains themselves were heaving. This was Sea of Tiberias. To me, the most evocative spot on earth. And here there are constant sudden squalls. It's so far below sea level. Above it, the Golan Heights. This great wind tunnel, which at evening, almost with daily regularity, you have those sudden furious squalls. And that's what happened. And the boat was almost swamped. Well, these men were experienced seamen. They were terrified. They were being tossed to and fro, helpless like corks. No control over the boat and the sea coming in. And here was this man, their master, their teacher, their Lord, their Savior, the one who loved them. And he was asleep in the midst of this seismic storm. Why? Partly again because of his own exhaustion. He was so drained by the effort of all that teaching, by all those questions. He was utterly spent, and so he slept. But it wasn't only that. It was the complete absence of anxiety. Remember, in Psalm 127 we are told that God gives his beloved sleep. You have this marvelous picture in that psalm of a man building a house, or a man keeping watch over a city. And they're so anxious, and they're so tense. They rise early. They go to bed late. They spend sleepless nights because they imagine that it all depends on their own efforts. They carry the whole world on their own shoulders, and so there's no sleep. But, says the psalmist, God gives his beloved sleep. And there was God's beloved in the stern of this little boat, in the midst of this furious seismic storm, and he's asleep on a cushion because he hasn't a care in the world. Not a single care in the world. But you say to me, he had cares, he had all those burdens. Well, you see, he had cast them upon the Lord. He had committed this day to his Father, committed this voyage to his Father. If he had stayed awake and watched and worried, that would have meant that he wasn't trusting his Father. And so he went to sleep. He was asleep because he had committed this day, this voyage, all these burdens committed to God. Now, it's no use saying to me, but he didn't have that kind of problem. He was in the middle of this furious storm, and he was bearing the sins of the whole world. And he knew that in a few, very few short months, he would be crucified. He knew all that. He had committed even the cross itself to his God and Father. And so he was asleep. And of course, he left us with the same teaching. Be careful for nothing. Don't be anxious about a thing. You remember Peter in Acts, expecting to face execution the following day, and he's asleep. Paul and Silas in prison, singing hymns as they await further torture. The great problem we have with them, we see these things as ideals, as impossible ideas, as things far beyond ourselves, whereas they're simply reflexes of our trust and our faith in God. He was asleep, not because there were no problems, not because there was no storm, not because he had no cares, but because he had dealt with them. He had done all that was humanly possible. He had cast them on his God and Father. And having done that, he went to sleep on a cushion in the stern of this boat, storm-tossed on the Sea of Galilee. So let's go over to the other side. And then he's asleep in the stern of the boat. And the third thing is this. He rebukes the disciples. In verse 40. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? These men, as we said, they were terrified. Their reaction is so interesting. It's interesting because they were experienced seamen. They had seen many a storm, and yet see how they react. They're terrified. I'm reminded to us that sometimes experience itself offers no solution and no immunity. Maybe they were so experienced that they hadn't felt it worthwhile to commend the voyage to God. They had done it so often. They had so much experience. Whatever happened, they could handle it. Experience sometimes breeding complacency. That's the way it was with these men. And even beyond that, they were absolutely panic-stricken. They were out of control. They probably even enhanced the risk of capsizing the boat. They shook the Lord. They were so out of control. Even beyond that, they were angry. The language of these men is so irreverent in verse 38. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Rabbi, why don't you care? You don't care. They were angry with him. And sometimes even those who are true believers are angry with God. Well, maybe there is a parabolic element here. They were terrified. They were panic-stricken. And they were angry with God. And sometimes that's how we react to some of our own human experiences. They terrify us. And we fall into blind panic. And we get angry with God. Have you ever felt this? You want to shake him. You want to give God a shaking. To wake him up. Ever accused God of not caring? Well, they'd been very interesting company. Those disciples, they wanted to shake him. And they said, you don't care. You don't care if we drown. The Lord rebukes them. Why are you so afraid? Is the man mad? This little boat, this little cork of a boat, and this heaving sea. He's asking us why we're afraid. That's what he does ask. Why are you afraid? And he's saying it to all our fears, to all our human fears. Why this fear? He's saying to them, they have no right to be afraid. No right at all. And you ask, you see, well, why had they no right to be afraid? And you can say to me, oh, it was because he was physically present with them. And we don't have him with us, and so we can be afraid. I don't think it was that. I don't think there was any guarantee available to these men that the boat wouldn't be swamped, that the boat wouldn't capsize. They're facing death, facing disaster. And he's saying to us that even in the face of the ultimate, even on the frontier, even on the edge of the abyss, you're saying, why this fear? Their trust in God. Where was it? Why this fear? Why afraid of the storm? Why afraid of the sea? Why afraid of dying? We mustn't wriggle away from the rigor, from the searchingness of it. This was peril at its most extreme. Death at its most imminent. And he's saying, why the fear? Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Does God's presence mean that we shall not die? Or does God's presence mean that he is with us in dying? And that death doesn't separate us from his love? Nothing cozy here. Disturbing, challenging, asking us, have we come to terms with the fact of death? With the certainty, the reality, the imminence of it? Faced it? Why this fear? These men were staring it in the face. And the Lord is asking them, why this fear? Why are you so afraid? And he's asking them, where is your faith? Do you still have no faith? Or as it is elsewhere, where is your faith? They had faith, you see. That was a great thing. That was a great mystery. If you had taken Peter out of that boat and put him into a pulpit, he would have said, all things work together for good to them that love God. But you take him from the pulpit into the boat, and he's terrified. The Lord is saying, where's what you preach? Those great promises of God. Where are they? Where is the trust? Where is the faith that you have? I know it's there. To back of your mind, depths of your heart. But what's it doing in this boat, in this storm, to those waves, to this tempest, to those heaving emotions in your own breast, to this blind panic, these seamen in this frail craft, staggering about in the boat itself to shake the man asleep in the stern, because they lost all control. Is it not so sad, you see? We go through a lifetime with great faith. And then, when the crisis comes, we don't apply it. A chaplain to a hospice told me some years ago that he had never seen anyone come to faith in a hospice, but he had seen many lose faith. It is that kind of challenge that arises from these words. Where, in the moment of stress, of blankness, of anguish, of loss, where is the faith? It is so easy to have pulpit faith and so difficult to have boat faith. And yet it's the boat faith, the storm faith. It's that faith that we so urgently need. And then there is this. The Lord rebukes the elements, the wind and the waves. Quiet, he said. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, quiet, be still. Now you want to allegorize. He makes the wounded spirit whole. He calms the troubled breast. Well, of course he does. But that's not the idiom to which this great message belongs. This was not a storm in somebody's heart. This wasn't some emotional upset. It was a storm out there. A real storm. Furious. The wind lashing the waves. And great gusts blowing down this great wind tunnel, the Sea of Tiberias. It was awe-inspiring. And this little man in this little boat, this man had been asleep only seconds before. This man gets up and he says to the elements, quiet, be still. When I read the passage, I read these words wrongly with a note of anger. I think these were very calm words. Quiet, be still. As if really the wind and the waves were very much less of a problem and less of an enigma than the disciples. There is no anger towards the elements. There is no judgment passed on the elements. Quiet. Be still. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He makes the wounded spirit whole. He calms the troubled breast, but he also commands the winds and the waves, and they obey him. The elements. And right through Mark's gospel, that is one of the great themes. The great elemental forces of creation are all subject to him. The wind, the waves, the demons, disease, death itself. He speaks to them and they obey. He speaks and they slink away. Why? In his hands he's got the whole world. He's got the wind and the waves in his hand. He's got everything in his hands. He's got everything. It's about him, you see. This Son of God who says to the elements, quiet, be still. I close on two notes. First of all, this word in verse 41. They were terrified. Literally, they feared a great fear. Let me share this with you for a moment. I read from the last chapter of Mark's Gospel, ending at verse 8. Now there is great debate as to the ending of Mark's Gospel. You will see that in the NIV, the last section is printed separately. And it is, in my judgment, fairly certain that that last section was not at first part of Mark's Gospel, and that view is held by most scholars. Not all agree, however, that the Gospel ends at verse 8. But I think there is good reason to believe that it did end at verse 8 of Mark 16. And I want to turn to it. I want you to see it. Suppose the Gospel of Mark actually ended at verse 8 of chapter 16. Do you see the last words? They were afraid. Now, apart from objective considerations, there is to me tremendous authenticity in that. If it stands as I think it should stand, it is to me the greatest ending in all human literature. Effabunto gar, for they were afraid. Mark gives us the smallest picture of Jesus. Where does it end? It ends with fear. This great, majestic Christ who says, "Quiet, be still." And they were afraid. In Jesus Christ, we meet the holy other, the ultimate. And our primary emotional response is fear. You can't trifle with a man who says to the wind and the waves, "Quiet, be still." How do you feel about Jesus? Do you like him? You're intrigued by him. You're interested in him. You're fascinated in him. You've nothing. I have nothing against him. But what about this, you see? They were afraid. The panic they had felt in response to the wind and the waves gave way to another fear. Christ displaced their fear. Their fear no longer directed to the wind and the waves, but towards the magnificence and the mysteriousness of his own unique personality. For they were afraid. And the last thing is this. They were not only left with fear, but they were left with a question. Who is this? What kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. You know, all over, it was a most disturbing experience for those disciples. And all over, it is a most disturbing narrative. It's meant to leave you afraid. And it's meant to leave you with a question. Who is this? I want to ask you this morning, you see. Can you really walk past a man who said to a storm, "Be quiet"? And immediately there was a great calm. You walk round him. You say, Would you say to me, well, that's interesting. Or would it not somehow latch on to you, live with you, ferment within you? Because what this narrative is doing to us today is taking us back to that Sea of Tiberias, to the store, to this Jesus, God's own Son. And it's asking you, who is this? Who on earth is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. May God use his word. Let us pray. Oh Lord, we ask that you would keep us from all irreverence, from all that's merely speculative, from all indifference to the truth, from all coziness beside the truth. Give us trust in thyself as our Father, but give us also, Lord, fear of your Son, and give us the grace that we'll spend what remains of this day reflecting on this question: who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Forgive us all our sin for your glory's sake. Amen. Our closing praise is Psalm 107 from verse 23 to verse 30, and the tune is Kilmarnock. Who go to sea in ships and in great waters trading be, within the deep these men God's works and his great wonders see. Psalm 107 verse 23, we stand to sing.